Okay, good afternoon everyone, and thanks, or good morning still, sorry, and thanks for joining this session today. My name is Wim Zwijnenburg. I work for PAX, which is a Dutch peace organization. We're based in the Netherlands. We work in 15 different conflict areas on a range of issues from peace building to protection of civilians and human security. But today I'm going to talk about a subject which is something that we've come across in our work. And we want to flag as a topic that it's really interesting to explore a bit further, and how we use this, namely the impact of conflict on the environment and how it's affect people and livelihoods, and also more and more climate resilience. So, as a short introduction, why is a peace organization working on environmental impacts of armed conflict? Well, basically the request came from our partners working in Iraq 20 years ago, when they were struggling with the impacts of the various Gulf wars that hit the region, and how it potentially could impact their health. But at the moment there was hardly any information how environmental damage and pollution had an impact on public health, on livelihoods, and on ecosystems. And which was an issue because it's very difficult to tackle these kind of problems if you don't have any information on these specific topics, because all the data that was collected was mostly on humanitarian crisis, economic problems in conflict-affected areas, but not so much environment, because environment is always seen as sort of soft issue, which was sort of an afterthought in many of conflict cases. And then back from 2009 onwards, there was a growing interest, in particular from the UN and the UN Environment Programme, started this whole phase on looking at, okay, if we look at the impact of conflict on the environment and what actually is happening in wars through the cycle of conflict, and how does it affect people, how it affects peace opportunities. And this is, for example, a really good explanation on the whole cycle of conflict, how it affects people, and also what the environmental impacts are and the causes, consequences throughout the conflict, and the environmental consequences in particular. But as I mentioned, there was hardly any information on these particular dynamics, like acute and long-term risks. So here I've briefly laid out what the environmental dimensions of conflict are, and then I'll later will explain to you how we're trying to work on addressing this through better data collection on the environmental damages. So here's a graphic we made for our work, which was supported by the UN Environment Programme to do an assessment of the ongoing war of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impacts of the environment. So here you'll see the strikes on near nuclear facilities, there's a potential higher human health risk, to all the way down here with deforestation and biodiversity loss in Ukraine, and what the long-term consequences of that could be for ecosystems that people depend on livelihoods. And there's all kind of stuff in between that's happening, like damage to industrial sites, water infrastructure, fuel infrastructure, and we start mapping all these kind of issues throughout the conflict. But before we actually got to this phase where we start to work on the environmental dimensions, a part of the work started off in 2014, 2015, when I'm also a long-time contributor to Bellingcat, which is an open source research collective. And one of the things that they were doing back at that time were really using open source documentation on war crimes in Syria, in particular around the bombing of cities and civilians. And part of it was oh, that's interesting. How can we use all these tools that's available to actually use these tools to also document the environmental impact? So the wealth of social media information helped us to understand why strikes were taking place, what kind of facilities they were targeting. We could see movements of ships. So here's sort of a quick overview, all this stuff that we're using. We're collecting information from all these social media sources. We were collecting satellite imagery from publicly available satellite providers. There's it all depends on the kind of topic you're looking into, but all this information was helpful, in particular in Syria. Later we started applying also in Iraq, at the moment in Ukraine, in Israel, and Palestine. We've done research on South Sudan, and a whole range of conflicts where we use all this kind of open source, open sources to sort of document what's happening in the conflict and what the potential impact is on people. At the same time, we also see this massive increase of satellite systems. So here's a quick overview, for example, what NASA has been doing, all kinds of satellites they have been using, for example, to detect fires, which we could use to detect fires in cities when fighting was taking place, or if a certain location was bombed. But NASA also does long-term spatial temporal analysis of changes in the environment, and I'll show you some satellite images later. But it's always freely accessible. So for us, it's very helpful because we could could use all these satellite imagery to actually document the environmental changes over time and use that in the quantification of environmental damages, but also in our advocacy work. And we come back to that later. Same issues also in the EU. The EU has a massive satellite system set up. It's all freely available. It's all tax money, so we could make use of that, these imagery in documentation of these environmental damages. But also looking into air pollution. So recently they've developed a new method to look at methane plumes. So we're now currently investigating damaged infrastructure in conflict-affected areas and methane release from that. And it's all freely accessible. So it's super interesting to explore that a bit more. So combining both the open source data with satellite imagery, you have a really powerful way to almost in near real time map and quantify the environmental impact of conflict and also to respond to that. And I'll give you some examples later. So here's an example for Syria, where there was a cement factory bombed in Aleppo in 2016. So here's an image from Maxar, which is put on Google Earth Pro, which now you can freely access it. And we also have an image from the ground. So here we did this documentation of all these hazardous facilities in urban areas which were damaged by the conflict. We have two sources, we can combine it, and you have a good sense of where there's potential hazardous substance release that could have been a problem for civilians living nearby, or in the long term when you need to do cleanup and remediation effort. So we started doing all this kind of mapping. This is one of our first reports. This is very basic stuff, how we visualized it. This is 2015. I was just playing around with paint and stuff. So this is still how to visualize these kind of things was a learning process for us as well. But it's kind of interesting, you can show, we can use all the overlap data from open source, OpenStreetMap, and then we use the Flash Environmental Assessment tool, which was created by OCHA to look at sort of natural disasters and release of hazardous substances. We started using it in conflict settings, so we could now map all the potential risk areas, which is helpful for humanitarian responders, but also in the long term to do environmental assessment. I think the turning point was in 2015 with the 2015 when ISIS was set on fire, all these oil fields in Iraq, and it's also documented for the world more how environmental damages has a health impact. And I think that was really helpful also to translate that to a larger audience, environmental issues is not a soft issue, but it has a direct impact on people's lives and livelihoods. Here's an example also from actually from the 2021 Israel invasion of Gaza, where we also did all of mappings of the sites which were damaged in the attack and looking at hazardous facilities. We're already sort of looking at into a moment as well. Well, here you see as well livelihoods from bombed orchards. Again, this is all 2021 data, and then we could all map it in a sort of an environmental overview. How the 10-day campaign had potential long-term environmental risk and direct risk for Palestinians in Gaza. So at the moment there's more work going on as well. Another example from Yemen, where we looked at using, again, planet imagery to look at leaking oil tankers in the port of Aden. So in this case, we used data from a local journalist we worked with. And there were all these abandoned oil tankers in 2015 who were leaking oil. We started mapping them on a monthly basis, or actually almost on a daily basis, and we could identify all these tankers there who were abandoned, were leaking, but nothing was being done about it. So collaboration with local journalists, but also with international journalists, we managed to get this on the political agenda. We raised some funding on it to show okay, you should address the cleanup of these tankers, because otherwise you have no access to the port anymore. And this was then resulted in funding through UN agencies to clean up these kind of tankers. So that's a very simple way where public imagery, public data can be used to create policy change. Another example here is in Iraq, where we looked at the flaring from oil refineries. So the Iraqi environmental governance is pretty weak. People in Iraq are still concerned in a post-conflict situation where there's a lot of mismanagement, in particular from the oil industry. Again, this is an article we wrote for Bellingcat on looking at the flaring industry and the impact on environment, but also on climate from their massive release from the flaring industry in Iraq. So it's a quick visualization using carbon dioxide and methane. This is not methane. This is I think it was carbon. Nitrous oxide. It's actually says by the bottom. Yeah, NO2. Thanks. Just to quickly visualize this. Here again, this was this massive sulfur mine which was set on fire by ISIS in 2016. This sulfur dioxide plume like spread over the whole world, and you can use the public satellite imagery to show the pollution. It's my colleague Ollie Ballinger from Bellingcat who really made a cool visualization. So you see the red plume spreading all over the world when the location itself was on fire, which you see here. Again, it's just a quick visualization. So how we do actually this kind of work. So for example, in Ukraine, we make a massive database. We look at all the incidents that are being reported on particular hazardous facilities that are being damaged. We archive them with our colleagues from Mnemonics who use social media to build all these kind of, to make sure that all the data is safe from all kind of social media platforms. We use satellite imagery to confirm the sites of being attacked, and then we classify them on different levels on sort of certainty. So you can build up a whole database on different kind of environmental damages along all kind of different kind of categories, and then we share that information. And this was particularly funded by UNEP. But we're trying also to share the information with relevant stakeholders. And these are some of the outcomes that we did. We looked at specific sites on like, industrial facilities, fossil fuel facilities, and energy facilities in Ukraine. But also, we use all kind of public data to look at the blow-up of the Kakhovka Dam and the fallout of all the damage of the water downstream and also upstream, and what it meant for agriculture, but also explosive remnants of war contamination, flooded industrial facilities, etc., etc. So again, it's all these open source data and satellite imagery can help visualize these kind of impacts. It can strengthen action, and well, a bit too far. And I think I've shared the wrong presentation with the upload the wrong presentation to the organizers. But then let's flip around a little bit. But I had some more documentation, but actually, like time-wise, I'm going to go back here a little bit. So I mentioned some of the topics, how we use the information in our advocacy work. I think it's now an opportunity also for my colleague Brittany, who's based here in New York and who can take over from here.
Okay. Shall we switch spots, I guess? Thanks. Thanks, yeah. My name is Brittany Roser, and I, as Wim has mentioned, am the UN advisor for PAX based here in New York. I think what you have been able to see from the presentation that we do have in front of us, all of these things are very visually compelling, and so that actually makes my job quite a lot easier to take to policymakers and actually show proof of impacts. As Wim has mentioned, that it is not necessarily a soft topic. The impacts on the environment from conflict are real, and they really are impacting protection of civilians' capacities for military actors, for development actors, humanitarian actors, as well as for civilian lives and livelihoods. So a lot of what we do at PAX is really trying to work through the life cycle of conflicts. No opposite of pun intended with life cycle there, but really looking at working on the before, during, after, and then of course the norm building for prevention going forward. My job is essentially to be working with international actors and taking the evidence gathered and the work that we have been doing, that Wim has been doing also with partners on the ground, to extrapolate recommendations for international actors. And we've been doing this with the ICRC, for example, through the update of their military guidelines in 2020. Yes, sorry, we have a slide with all of this on it. Unfortunately, that is not available, which has also led to quite a lot of updates also on the legal side of things. So their military guidelines, legal principles within the ICRC, as well as within the 6th Committee of the General Assembly during conflict, also looking at reporting mechanisms. So he's already mentioned the Joint Environment Unit, so that looks more at natural hazards, but also looking at, for example, the annual reporting of the Secretary General on the status of protection of civilians each year and using these visualizations to actually document the impacts directly on civilians, as well as working after conflicts or somewhat during in the post-conflict phase, working on environmental assessments, building this into rehabilitation and reconstruction policies to ensure that there is environmental peace building for more sustainable peace building. And then finally looking at norm building. So we have been working quite a lot on building with the Security Council and within the General Assembly more of a mainstreaming of an environment, peace, and security agenda, because at the moment within the UN system, within the international system, I think you can notice by all of the different actors that I've mentioned, from practitioners through policymakers, it's a very disparate and disjointed process of addressing environmental issues in conflict. And so we're really trying to advocate for the international system to come up with a more coherent and coordinated system to be able to address some of the environmental impacts. For example, the delays in resourcing, in challenges in political access that the Security Council had and the UN system had in addressing the FSO SOFR situation within Yemen, which we touched a little bit on, and the risks for civilians in that area. Even with joint action within the Security Council, which we all know at the moment is quite hard to achieve, there still were quite significant delays and every day a further risk. So we really want to urge the international community to work more efficiently and in a more coherent and coordinated manner through establishing more of an environment, peace, and security agenda, and really mainstreaming that throughout the entirety of the system. We also see that as addressing not only environmental impacts of conflict, but also the climate impacts that climate risks that are really causing an uptick also in conflict itself. We don't have the other slide, right?
No.
Unfortunately. There is another slide that would be very visually appealing, I think, to show that although this has, these agendas really began 30 years ago, within the last 5 to 10-ish years, there has been a really a greater recognition and a greater uptick in the amount of different policies, practices that have been established at the international level, whether it be through the UN Environmental Assembly, the General Assembly, the Security Council, different actors' attention to the environment within conflicts and the impacts that they have. And so we really do see a momentum moving this forward and think that right now is the time to be capitalizing on this, which is also why our work has really grown in the past few years. However, at least from my experience in New York, there aren't that many actors in this space really working on advocacy, and we're really looking for partners. So part of the reason we're also here today is to make these advocacy pitches, but also to see who within this space might be interested in also working with us and or assisting with resourcing to really push this forward, because there is quite a lot out there. And there's also quite an appetite for this, and we're hoping to really expand our impacts. Anything else I missed?
No, I think that's really captured very well, like the link between research and advocacy. And yeah, as a last point, yeah, I think we're more engaging in conflict-affected areas, look at how climate impacts is making things worse there. So we're also expanding our like geospatial capacity on that. And again, like in terms of data collection and sharing, we're very much open to collaborate on that. So please have a chat afterwards, and happy to see where we can find like overlap in our work, or where we can find space to work together. Yeah, again, my apologies for I'm trying to think of what went wrong with uploading the right presentation. But I think, yeah, as just a final note, like there's so much. I think that's why this conference is super interesting, because you have all these different groups like collecting different kind of data sources or data itself. And we really want to show that this kind of data can be helpful. It can influence policies. In our case, in particular, looking at the environmental and climate impacts. But I think there's what I've learned also from our work with Bellingcat, like sharing resources, sharing expertise is really helpful in putting on building like different kind of security agendas, be it human security or environmental security. So thanks also for coming in, and yeah, looking forward to some of the discussions later. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. You guys hear me okay? Yes? And then the clicker, is that?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right.
Give you some space.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You guys are fine. You can stay here. So, perfect. Hi. My name is Greg. Can you hear me? You can. Okay. My name is Greg. I'm really quite honored to be here with you all today. I've been working in the field of conflict data analysis for quite a while, and I think a little bit about sort of the fact that this conference exists, and it's pretty amazing. I'm really happy to see some of my old colleagues from the State Department when I worked at the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations who are here and have done such amazing work over the past few years. And I'm here to talk about a product that my company, Exchange Design, has been working on for the past, I'd say, few months, to be honest with you. And the reason is that the technology has only really been available to us for the past few months or so. And so I'm here to tell you that we've solved all of our forecasting issues with generative AI. No, not at all. So I'm not going to tell you about how LLMs can be used for conflict early warning and crisis prevention. But I am going to talk today about generative AI and its application to something that we call AskACLED, and this is a prototype. And so what we're here to share with you today is a very functional prototype, but I think we really want to hear from you all about your concerns with generative AI, but I will start by sharing some of my own concerns with generative AI before I show you why I actually think it's pretty cool. But first, what are large language models? Let's use Google's definition because we're in their building. So a large language model, as you can see on the screen, is a machine learning model that aims to predict and generate plausible language. And some of us were out to dinner last night, and my takeaway from the conversation was that they are great liars. You know, these tools are wonderful at telling you stuff that just isn't true, because it's writing a sentence based on a word prediction of the previous word. That is highly problematic. And as we continue to use these generative AI applications, we are using them every day to create text, images, music. And I'm a musician, and so I think about all my musician friends who are not going to have jobs soon because you can just create music. So there are some potential challenges with these technologies. But as we think about these problems, they go beyond just what they mean for people's livelihoods. They go into issues such as the fact that the large language models that we all use, like ChatGPT and Bing, they are trained on the internet. They have general knowledge, and that knowledge is not current. And so the information is a couple of years old, depending on the large language model that you use. These base models are very expensive to train and update. So if you did want to add more information to them, you would have to have a lot of computing power and some very specialized knowledge to create these things. That leaves them as sort of a general utility application that I think probably most of you in this room have touched at some point. And when I first logged in and started using ChatGPT, I was astounded. I thought, this is incredible. How do I know what it's saying? Why do you want my phone number? And that led to this idea, which is to create an application that is based on your content, that has flexible connectors to different types of large language models, and is organization specific. So the vision for the application that we've been building, which is called evidence-based.ai, but the application here is really around how it can be used for one of my favorite tools, which is the AskACLED data set, is the possibilities of generative AI controlled by and optimized for your organization and for very specific use cases. So what does it look like? It's a chat interface, like most of the other ones that you use. And that's great. I mean, it's a tool that allows you to go and talk to it. And when we started to build this tool, because a lot of what we were all accustomed to when we started using generative AI was chat interfaces, this is where we began. So this is actually a picture of the application running, and this is a real-time conversation with AskACLED data. And I hope that these are right answers, and so I will let the AskACLED team out in the audience give me a thumbs up or thumbs down, because these are generated by the application. And so what is AskACLED, before we talk a little bit more about the interface and the different things that it can do? The idea behind this application is dynamic and real-time content. And so if you do get new documentation on the AskACLED data set, you can upload it. You don't have to wait 2 years for someone to come in and scrape it off of your website and update it. You can say, we have a new version out, we're going to upload it, and we can talk to that directly. It is integrated analysis. So by combining different types of analysis products with the interface, you can hone in on specific regions. You can hone in on specific years. And it is transparent. And we'll talk a bit more about the transparency in a moment. And the last one, which is maybe the most I'd say complex from a user perspective, and something that we're going to have to do a lot of testing on, is natural language queries. And so instead of using Tableau or using Power BI to get a summary of your information, you just say, how many events occurred in Myanmar in March? And it tells you the answer. The underlying technology is text-to-SQL, which we can talk about if anybody wants to get into that stuff. And so the components of the application currently are 3 streams of information. One is AskACLED analysis products. So the team produces research. The next is AskACLED documentation. The team explains to you how their data is managed and tagged. And the last is the data itself. Again, to be fully transparent with you all, because this is something we're actively building, the first 2 of these work very well. The last one does work, but you can start asking it stuff, and we need to make sure it tells you the right answer before giving it out to the public. But I will, again, defer to the AskACLED team on everything, and for the Q&A, I'll be pointing to them a lot. So back to the chat interface. What you have here is a tool that allows you to ask natural language questions of anything that we put into the product. And one of the, I think, the reasons why this tool is so important, and this is a GIF, and I think we're at the end of the GIF, so if you wait, okay, now we're back at the beginning. So this is actually a picture of the tool. You ask it a question, and you click on sources. Yay, we know why it says what it says. And you click on that, and you can just talk to that one document. So you start by asking a question of everything. You get an answer. You press on source, and then you hone in on that specific document so you can ask further questions. And to verify it, you can download it. And this solves, I think, for me, and many of the people who I've worked with in my world of conflict analysis, that is everything. And I think about my time, I worked at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I was surrounded by brilliant people who wrote lots of research papers that sit on shelves. And then I worked at the State Department. We wrote lots of documents that sit on someone's hard drive. And then I worked at DI Global, where we wrote lots of papers that, again, sit in the same place. The possibility of having all of these things at your fingertips is much better, I think, than a SharePoint search engine. And we're not in the Microsoft building, so I feel comfortable saying that. And so just to talk a little bit more about the approach, so the idea of this application is really based on an approach called retrieval augmented generation, which is essentially combining a search engine with a summarization engine. But we do a lot more than that on the way to indexing these documents. One of the first things that we do is keyword extraction. One of the reasons keyword extraction is important is so that you can triangulate between your documents. And so if you're indexing all of your information, we do use some entity recognition tools to identify the most commonly used words that are not he, she, it, they, and, or, but, all the stop words that we're used to pulling out. And so we tag all of these documents. This is obviously not AskACLED, this is a different one. We tag all these documents by key terms. We also tag locations and key actors. And so we can extract all the names, we can extract all the locations, so that by the time we're done indexing all of your content, you actually have a map of everything. You have a map of where your documents are. You have lists of people's names, which we're still fine-tuning because you get like weird names that aren't real names, so there's a lot that goes into machine learning that we're still getting right. But the idea is that this technology could be much more than just a chat interface. It could actually be a knowledge management tool for getting into your content and learning about it in ways that you were not able to before. So just to give you a sense of how we built it, again, this is a piece of technology that we kind of just started building in the spring. So we thought, hey, this might be cool. So this is very much a pet project that has turned into something a lot more than that. But this is a Python application. We are using LangChain and Llama Index, which are these wonderful tools that are allowing Python developers to build retrieval augmented generation applications. We started out by using a vector database this year, but have recently moved over to using Postgres because it's open source. And so we're trying to move to a completely open source stack if we can. And as I sort of mentioned in the beginning, one of the real points that we're trying to make here is that we can switch out the large language model. So as these tools are changing, as the new LLMs are becoming available, we can kind of plug new ones in. And so this application is agnostic to which LLM you use. We can decide which one is better for which use case. Sometimes you do need the biggest one. Sometimes you just need something really small and fast that answers your questions well. And so just as I think about this technology, I just want to acknowledge that we are at like peak hype in generative AI. Like, it's all over the place, and I'm aware of that. And so Gartner puts out these reports occasionally that just say, where are we? And just like the conflict diagram, we're all gonna like fall down and die here at the bottom because the technology decides it's not useful anymore. I think blockchain and NFTs are like below the line here. But we're at the top. And I think one of the reasons why we wanted to present on AskACLED is that the more we can get from, oh, this is shiny and new and flashy and isn't that great, AI is going to solve everything, to here are some very clear ways that we can use AI to make our lives a little bit more efficient, the better. And so while we are up here, I like to think we aren't going to go all the way down to the bottom of the trough of disillusionment because we might be able to find some use cases like the one we're here to talk about today. So I think that's all I've got. There's a lot more that we could talk about when it comes to the application to ACLED, but thank you. And I think we have time for questions, and so I would like to make sure I'm not by myself up here.
Well, maybe. Thanks, Greg. That was cool. Even though it might be on the top of the hype kind of curve, I still think that is really, really cool work, and I hope we'll see more of that. So one thing I would be super interested in, are you retraining any of the Hugging Face models? And if so, would you be willing to kind of share those back on Hugging Face? That would be super helpful for other people going into this.
Yeah, I'll take a couple. Yeah.
Sorry, thanks. I guess we'll start with that one.
Sure. If you can hear me. For PAX. Okay.
Of activity.
Thanks very much for PAX. I love the presentation. I love these data sources and these instruments and what they allow us to do. Have you seen any examples of using these to try to identify like targeting strategies or kind of motivations for strikes instead of exclusively the environmental outcome? And it's not always fair to ask a question that you didn't present about. I realize that, but I'm just very curious, genuinely. Yeah.
Shall I go first, then you guys answer?
Sure.
So the application, the use of retrieval augmented generation means that we're not doing a whole lot of retraining of models. We can fine-tune them, and as we have approaches of fine-tuning, we can absolutely share those. But the advantage to using a RAG approach is that if you need to add a document for the bot to talk to, you index it, you update it, and you put it into your database. And then as you're evolving it, you're really evolving the corpus of content, not the model itself. And that is, I think, the real advantage and the speed associated with this type of tool is that you're focused more on what kinds of questions should it be able to answer more than how should the model behave, because there are some really brilliant people doing that work. And so a lot of what I've shown you is kind of built on just the incredible work done in the technology community and just trying to take it and make it as accessible to some of the problems that I think those of us in the conflict field are trying to wrestle with.
Yeah, to answer your question about open source being used for targeting, yeah, there have been examples in Ukraine twice, for example, where Russian bloggers were tracing position of Ukrainian units based on footage that they shared online, and they identified the location, and then the location was bombed. But at the same way, also like some Russian positions were geolocated by open source analysts and then being shared online, and then the data was apparently picked up by the Ukrainian army, and then this location was bombed as a result as well. In Syria, we did a large mapping of makeshift refineries. So you saw it during the conflict. There was a lot of like the oil infrastructure was bombed, but the pumping still worked. So there was a lot of like smuggling of crude oil, and as a result, like a lot of communities and civilians, but also armed groups started to use makeshift refineries, and we started mapping them, like tens and tens of thousands of them, through the eastern Syria. But there was a discussion point, like, should we put all these locations online? Because we saw a couple of videos where both the US-led coalition and also Russia was targeting makeshift refineries, claiming they were run by ISIS, and most of these locations were probably run by local communities, and they would make money out of that because of sustaining a living. And then ISIS would just like take the oil, but then still they were being targeted. So at some point we didn't make a whole online map of it, just like giving some general areas. But the trade-off is always like, it's all open source data, so I'm pretty sure there are these kind of militaries also using that as well for targeting. So but yeah, it's like you need to balance that in terms of like, can it be misused? And sometimes you do, and you also see it in Ukraine as well with some of the maps that are being produced by Conflict Observatory, this US-led initiative, where they take like general maps and not give too much details, but you still want to visualize the severity of the impact of the war without giving like specific locations. So that's why you always have to balance like security risk versus advocacy-based sort of visualization maps. So yeah, but it happens, yeah, in conflicts.
We have one question online quickly. Is when will AskACLED be released for public use?
So I don't think there's any plan to release it anytime soon to the public, but I'm happy to get others from the ACLED team to weigh in on this one. I don't think we have a good answer. And I think one of the reasons is that this technology is so new that there's a level of verifiability and testing that needs to go into the use of the tool. I think the different layers of the application, talking to content is one thing, talking to data is another. And so I think there's a fair amount of internal deliberation that we're going to have to do before there's a clean answer to that question.
We would agree, yes?
Yes.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, very much. I think that we have, you know, this is stage one. It's taken quite a while to get here. So I think stage two is refining some of these processes, seeing what works. I have thank you so much for that. That was brilliant. Thank you, Greg. I have a question for the PAX crew. So that was fascinating work, especially, of course, about the environmental damage that conflict does. I have a question about maybe some of the more common and maybe kind of banal damage, like, for example, bombing of roads or the prevention of, let's say, seeding or, you know, farming, for example, in conflict areas. Is there a way to think about those types of common damages that happen within a conflict area and how we can be better at kind of assessing what populations need based on how much the conflict has kind of intersected or interacted with their livelihoods?
Yeah, there's already quite a lot of work done on that. So for example now, and that's where one slide I had added in there is like we recently published an article for the ICRC's review looking at like leveraging of like emerging technologies on, and we looked at the environmental data, but there's like other types of data you can use as well, like in particular looking at machine learning and artificial intelligence. And one of the applications is that, for example, is looking at urban damages with Sentinel-1, which is radar data, and Sentinel-2, which is optical satellite imagery data. And now they're applying this sort of machine learning lessons to quickly do that. Because like traditionally, this kind of damage assessments of urban areas and all kind of infrastructure would be done with high-resolution imagery. And you have like either European humanitarian agencies or the UN satellite agency who get the commission to do that kind of damage assessment and then go through it, high-resolution imagery which is very expensive because you have to buy it from Maxar. And now there are all these kind of initiatives to look at, okay, how can we use like freely available data to come to at least a better understanding of that with like with limited means, and how can we use machine learning to improve that kind of damage assessment. And that's kind of an interesting way forward, and to look at the wider sort of damages in conflict with publicly available imagery on a faster way, so you don't have to depending on like UN agencies to do that, who also need budgets and need to be commissioned. And I think that's the interesting development at the moment, where you see like academics and universities working together to make these kind of data sets more available. That's just more a general answer on general questions. Does it help that, or?
I mean, I think that people often they switch the causal frame to the environmental damages leading to conflict. So I'm asking, I suppose it's because I'm doing a review of food security and how conflict affects it. And it occurred to me that we could do the same for climate change impacts, which is the conflict is there. So how is it then going to affect adaptation, food security, and all of the ways that people build resilience to, acute climate changes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's a complex question, and like there are many things popping up in my head. But I know, for example, I just only give you like practical examples. I know, for example, in at the moment in Ukraine, Planet's working with a couple of universities to look at. They use like crater damage assessments to look at all the front lines, how many craters they can detect with satellite imagery on agricultural land, so to predict how much the lands are being affected, how much land needs to be cleared, and then you can make all these kind of calculations. Or they use like all this sort of satellite imagery to see how much land is not being used or abandoned, and then based on that you can make calculations on access to land for farmers and how it impacts food security. The same thing is also like would be interesting to explore as well in other conflict areas. So unfortunately, I missed the presentation yesterday from the Carter Center on looking at explosive remnants of war and how to like map that and what the kind of implications are for food security or for agricultural communities. But I think geospatial data is really driving that, because without having access to conflict areas, you can still do these kind of assessments. And if in particular, if you combine it with other data sets on, for example, is there land change only from the conflict, or do you see if you involve all the data sets on is like temperatures or precipitation, and what is if there's a change in that, if you combine it with conflict data or with AskACLED data on like incidents, or you can sort of construct a sort of better picture of what the impacts are for security.
What about your research on impacts on agriculture and deforestation, for example, as well, right? Those have direct impacts on livelihoods and would be relevant.
Yeah, you mean on Syria?
Yeah.
So we did also some research on like 12 years long, looking at how the conflict affected forest loss throughout the conflict, and what kind of implications that for climate resilience. So how much carbon sinks would you lose with? Because like in Syria, like over 40% of all the forest was gone after the conflict, mainly driven by energy needs, but also fightings or deliberate destruction or forest fires because there was no forest management. So we looked at that, like, okay, what are the implications for also the climate resilience link with that, and what can in particular, and then we brought in other data to see like if there's other risks from climate change that is felt throughout the country.
And if I may just quickly, I work on environmental impacts, and that's what we're here to discuss today, but this is part of a broader aspect of harm that we're looking at for civilians in conflict. So we at PAX like to broaden the definition of civilian harm, not to only include impacts, for example, civilian casualties, but actually looking at impacts on lives and livelihoods as well. So we have a civilian harm mitigation project as well within our protection of civilians project, where we're working with interested states, so the United States, the Netherlands, as well as my job focusing on the United Nations, to develop civilian harm mitigation policies that really look at prevention, mitigation, and reporting, and response, of course, as well, in ensuring that we are monitoring impacts beyond just climate impacts, or looking also at livelihoods, looking at if a UN mission it goes by in a helicopter, are they tearing the roof off of a house as well? Like, how are these remedied? So there are broader implications for this use as well. I hope that answers. Thanks.
Hello. Gregory, I have a question for you. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's very interesting. Like condensing corpus of analysis into something that's useful and at the tip of your fingers is could be really useful in all kinds of humanitarian spaces. I'm a little curious as to the use case of also accessing the data set, because to me it seems like who actually has made use of these one-offs queries to a data set like that, and if it's not one-offs then it's automatic, and then you wouldn't use an LLM maybe to access the data set. That seems like a very expensive API.
So the underlying search function with a structured data set and an unstructured data set is very different. But the large language model still plays a role in the conversation. With the unstructured documents, we are indeed storing them as text, long rows of text vectors, and then using vector embeddings to create search engines. The search engine finds the most relevant node, sends it back to the LLM summarizes it, sends you back a response. That's fairly common. Talking to the data set, the LLM is used to do the translation from your sentence to a SQL query, which then runs the query through the SQL database and then translates back the response into a sentence for you. And so it's playing a role at a couple steps of the process. These LLM calls are becoming much less expensive over time. So you're talking about fractions of a penny per call. And so the use in this case probably wouldn't overwhelm your budget. You wouldn't be blowing through your budget of LLM calls to try to answer specific questions about the data. But then then how you would use it over time, the ability to ask a question of a very large data set and get mean and summary statistics at your fingertips without having to build a new dashboard or filter your Excel database every time. It is a new way of interacting with data, and I think we're all going to have to wrestle with how we feel about that, and how do we have the same verifiability as we do with the report, and what is it that you want to see? Do you want to see the rows of data and then the paragraph written so that you can trust it? Because one of the things that we heard about in the very intro session from the speaker at Google was about traceability of everything that you're seeing. How do you trust and know that the answers are correct? And so there's probably quite a few LLM calls that need to happen during that text to SQL query function. And that's one of the reasons why we're still playing with it, is that we indeed need to know that if the answer is 7, that we can tell that the answer is 7 by looking at some other metric. I hope that answers the question.
Do we have other questions? Yes.
Well, to you, Greg, just because I find this very intriguing. I really hope this turns out to be a super good product, because I've been telling people to use Hugging Face and LangChain to do something similar. Yeah. So, now my reputation rests with you. I told them that this was a good idea. So I'm thinking also about a bit what we talked about yesterday in regards to getting people perhaps too much room to interpret it. what are your thoughts in regard to putting, hard constraints on what your model is going to tell people? Because, the more freedom you give people, the more satisfied they're going to be, right? But perhaps there's also a limit to the amount of freedom that is, right? They should not be able to kind of get the AskACLED model to give, information that is not strictly false, but is falling into, the lies and thermal lies and statistics kind of thing. So what are your thoughts in regards to that?
Yeah, I think how to give users the right level of control over their search is something we wrestle with a lot. That's true of both structured and unstructured documents. So if you're talking to unstructured content, you run into a lot of challenges when you create different indexes. Let's say you have an index about one country and an index about another country. You want to ask questions of both of them. You want to do comparisons across documents. You only want to talk to documents that have been tagged as gender-based violence. All of a sudden, you want to sort of cut through your content in very specific ways, and you want to know that the answers you're getting back are from that slicing of the content. And so that's one of the reasons we've been adding metadata. One of the versions that we've built actually has metadata filters at the bottom, so you say just talk to documents that have been tagged in the following ways, so that you can give that control over to users. I think that doesn't really get to your question, though, which is to say, how do we allow users to ask questions, get back answers, and do it in a trustworthy way over time, which is a really big question, and one that I don't actually have an answer for you. Our approach thus far has been sourcing, source everything. Give people a source and a citation for every answer that they are given, so that you say to them, if you're going to put this somewhere, do your homework and read the background content. And over time, as you use these tools, I think you get more and more comfortable with the way that they answer questions and probing further and using the tool responsibly. And I think that is a people change management question. I don't think the technology is going to come and take care of that for you. So I think there's training that's going to need to go into this. I think user controls over the technology that guides people through a responsible way of using it. And I think we're all going to have to work on it together. And that's one of the reasons why we built this and are showing it before it's done, because we'd rather have a conversation about how to use it responsibly than just to say, here it is, sign up and use it. It's going to be great every time, because it's not.
I think this will have to be the last question, because we're 2 minutes left.
Thank you for that. And Greg, we touched upon this a bit yesterday, but it's this question about, I guess, external validity or replication, or to what degree you can scale this technology to be equally or close to equally applicable to different data sets. So us at our unit, we use Tableau to do all the data analysis. And it can be time consuming up until you sort of set up a template with the calculations and everything. And so we've used other sort of LLM, NPL technologies to generate what we called yesterday these summaries, bullet points. What percentage change increase from one month to the other according to which category. How do you foresee the possibility, because you're at a sort of pilot stage, to be able to use that technology? In our case, because we have this data warehouse with all these data sets, we'd like to use that technology to summarize across indicators and data sets, because ultimately that's what we want, right? With like a 360 image or diagnostic of everything that would allow us to have a more complete picture of things. And maybe even just seeing, it's all about things going up and down or things being concentrated or spread. So can we get a picture of that across different data sets? Do you foresee your technology being able to do that? Thanks.
Yes, but. So yes, the tool can be used across different domains. We can build conversational AI on anything, to be honest with you, but it's not going to be good until you think about the use case. The metadata tags that we use to do the filtering need to be curated, because if we just use an open-ended spacey model to extract the best key terms, what it thinks are key terms, it won't be domain specific. And so we need to do work each time to extract the right information for the right topic. So if you're working in a health context, it's going to focus on what's relevant to you and your public health work. If you're working in agriculture, it's relevant to you in agriculture. That's not large language models and generative AI. That's old school machine learning, natural language processing that we use to make the application relevant and functional for an organization. The other challenge that, and one of the other use cases we find people want, is they want to talk to every document. Summarize the difference between every document in my library, and it just can't do that in one shot. It would take a long time. And so then it's, how do we use these tools? How do we write a for loop so that you can run through every single document, ask the question of every document, and then do an analysis on top of that? And so it's actually beginning to use it more rigorously and academically, because we actually understand from a computing perspective what these tools can and cannot do. And so I mean, you're asking, it's a big question that you're asking. Can we scale with this tool? Can we scale with this tool as it is to build conversational agents for any organization? Sure. But I think that's just the beginning of where they're useful and how they could be used, because there's so many other things that we could do if we can wrap our heads around all the places we've all stored our data and what we actually would ask if we could with a summarization engine like this. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. So I think that closes the session. So maybe a round of applause for